My name is David Goreman. I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ. I've been delivered from drugs, drug addiction, sexual addiction, depression, and in recovery for anger issues. So many of the things that silently navigated my life happened before I ever heard of any kind of recovery. I was born in 1959 to parents who on the surface seemed to have it all together. We lived in a middle-class neighborhood with mostly whites, but also a small group of blacks. My father was an accountant and my mother worked 2 jobs. On the surface, it all seemed so great, but inside our home, it was a different story. My father was always at the office and my mom at work. I had 2 older sisters and 1 older brother at home. I learned that my father was married once before and had at least 3 children. I remember going to Untitled Chapter Methodist Church as a family. I also remember us having huge Christmases and great holidays. And it seemed to me like everything was okay. Slowly everything changed though. The arguments and the fighting. One day my father came home and announced that he had found a new religion, Islam. And from now on, he would follow and was joining the Nation of Islam. Mom, a Christian with a taste for scotch, and Dad, a Muslim with a military attitude. As the fighting grew intense, I could see our family crumble fast. More drinking, more fighting. One Sunday morning after an argument, my mother shot Dad out front on the porch in front of all of us. I can remember having on Sunday clothes and my sister in their sundresses and the coldness of my mother as she took off his tie and made a tourniquet to stop his legs from bleeding. As she leaned over him and said, "Look what you made me do." They divorced in 1969. I was 10 years old. Dad remarried shortly after, and I spent a lot of time wondering what happened to Mom and how did we end up with Dad. His new wife practiced Islam too. My life had drastically changed whether I was willing or not. No more holidays, Christmases, Easter, or Thanksgiving. Nothing. No more sports or anything with school or even friends. Just temple, selling the newspapers door to door, and working out and exercising with the other Muslims. It was like training for war and anyone white was the enemy. Including my friends, they all had to go. I ran away several times trying to find my mother, and the few times I seen her, she seemed to be going downhill fast. After a few runaway attempts, my dad let me go and told me to never ask him for anything else. He kept his word. That's when I walked into a living hell. The area my mother moved to was an area we were not allowed to go to when we were living with my dad. She lived with a man who sold alcohol illegally, and the house had an apartment in it. When I first got there, I walked past my mother to knock on the door. I didn't even recognize her at first. Bloody knees, swollen face, nasty clothes. I remember the first time I seen her boyfriend standing there. He seemed like a giant with Coke bottle glasses and a large gun on his waist. He pointed behind me and said, "There's your mother right there." Of course, he didn't call her mama. First shock, she was intoxicated and acted like it was just another day. Through tears, she said, "My baby came to see me." We walked inside the house. I will never forget the dark, foul-smelling place and the biggest German Shepherd I'd ever seen. Terrified, I spent the rest of the day listening to my mother being cussed out and all the things he would repeat day to day. My money's not going to run out. I own this corner. I've been an associate member of the police department since 1945. I'm paying. I ain't playing. He said those things the first time he beat my mom in front of me, the first and the second. Some nights I held her through alcoholic shakes that no matter how I held her, you couldn't stop them. Sex with different men and women who came to buy liquor, but I was the worker. Made to clean, paint, cut the grass, drive to his apartment in Elkhart and do the same. At 14 years old, I was driving on the highway with 2 drunk adults and a Bobo the shepherd. New to the neighborhood, I had my own challenges. 2 of the kids I met had pimps in their family. One had a dad who would let us hang out at the house where the prostitutes lived. The other kid had an uncle straight out of the movies, fur coats, etc. I had my first sexual encounter with a 26-year-old woman, not realizing that all the things I had seen sexually would cause me to have a strong addiction to porn and a lack of sensitivity about sex. After all, it was just sex. I started smoking cigarettes and marijuana at the same time. It was just a part of every day, like Mom and her boyfriend, starting each day out with liquor and coffee and ended up a lot of times with fighting. By now, though, I could help my mom fight. So I was told to sleep in the basement, a wooden crate with a toilet on it. wet walls with a huge oil furnace in the middle, a room with a padlock on the outside of the door. From the basement, I would hear everything, but I couldn't get to her. Unless, of course, he brought her downstairs to me or slapped her down the steps. Total nightmare. No adult supervision. I could do as I pleased. So the street seemed easier. Drugs and sex. I tried to stay away, but I couldn't leave my mother that way. That was the lowest point. I don't remember much about school during that time. It was a blur. My mother was always talking about her mama and daddy in Camden, Alabama, and how she wanted to go home. I didn't know until recently that my sister told my grandparents about my mother's state. One day, in the midst of hell, there was a knock at the door. There stood an old man who I'd never seen. Overalls, old and tattered, a pair of shoes, and a hat with a heavy sweat ring. But he had on a really nice suit coat. It was Granddad. My mother's whole attitude changed when she knew that he was coming to get her. He took us to the Trailways bus station, never saying a word to us. He didn't even sit with us. He didn't look happy about how he found the oldest of his 13 children. On the bus, my mom took out her cigarettes and a half pint of liquor and stuck it in the back of the magazine pouch on the seat. She promised she would never drink or smoke again, and she never did. But I did. No one ever asked me what I had seen or had been through, or when I was molested by someone that came to the bootleg house. That being a constant reminder of the basement. The first weeks in Alabama were just as life-changing. Going from running the streets and doing whatever I wanted to getting up early in the morning and feeding the hogs, the goats, the chickens, the dogs, the roosters, and then we ate. Working in the field after school, changing tractor tires by hand. I waited on Granddad to say anything to me other than do this or do that. I only heard him talk a lot at church. We attended Gravel Creek Baptist Church, about 25 members, and we were at church all the time. If not our church, someone else's revival. I first started hearing from Grandma in the congregation talking about a God who could do anything. Saved my mother, but I couldn't understand it yet. Was I a bad person? Is that why all of that happened to me? And who in Alabama in the 70s even cared? I never told anyone about the beatings, alcohol, sexual molestation, anger and shame, or despair. I walked around now in another strange place just to act it out. I got married at 18 years old, separated at 19, in jail most of my 19th year. Got out, and by then my mother was back in Indiana, sober and a leader in her church. Me, just out of jail, angry, totally confused about life. Then came the first miracle from God. I got back to Indiana. I started working, burying all my feelings from the past. I even started going to church sometime, praying for something to fill the void in me, from family dysfunction, chemical dependence, alcohol, marijuana use, physical, emotional, sexual abuse, and pornography addiction. I had learned to numb my feelings and deal with it by making bad decisions about sex and women. God's miracle was out of nowhere. I was invited on a blind date and met my beautiful wife, Gail, and her 3 sons, Mark, Greg, and Jeremy. We were like water and oil. Me being all that I just described, and her coming from a Lutheran background. Wow, she believed in going to church like her mom taught her. I started going to church just because that's what I impressed Gail. 11 years of Zion Lutheran, private school for the kids, and never realizing that God was there all the time and had never left me. But I didn't know him. The only thing I knew how to do was take care of other people, not myself. I wasn't important, only the ones I loved. Silently struggling inside, turning to work as a release, 1 job, 2 jobs, 3 jobs. Work, work, work. I had to take care of my wife and kids. I met Gail in 1981. We married in 1983. I felt like that was my one and only reason for living. I'm sure my lack of relationship with God caused me to make a lot of decisions that were not the best. I remember reading psychology and articles, anything to help me be a better parent and a decent husband. Reading the Bible and not understanding that all my answers were right there. Remember my grandparents' voices saying, the Lord won't put more on you than you can stand, and all things work together for the good of the Lord. And every Sunday they stood up and gave a testimony about how good God is. testimony. I felt like in 1991, everything was perfect. Best job I ever had, nice house, cars, boats, campers. I got up to go to work one day and I couldn't get dressed for 3 months. I cried and stayed in my room, scared my wife and kids, who up to now thought I could handle anything. What happened? I couldn't put my finger on it. What part of my past hurt so much? Should I just pick one? I remember going to counseling for the first time and trying to deal with everything. I hadn't heard of a Christian counselor. We just picked a psychologist that came highly recommended and paid $150 per hour. It was like an accelerated step forward, a lot more intense, but not effective. Prozac prescriptions and counseling twice a week. God was making a way even then I wasn't thinking about. I never asked for disability at my job. I can't remember how I was able to receive it, a few $100s a week from long-term disability. But I would go home from therapy and I would still be in the same condition. But I remember praying. In the beginning of the 4th month, still not leaving home and only maintaining myself enough to operate somewhat normally while my wife and kids were up. After they left for work and school, I was alone again. It was almost like finally being able to breathe without feeling like I was going to break down. The last thing I wanted to do was hurt my family. I would spend hours listening to gospel music. I had hundreds of tapes and all sorts of music, but only gospel music made me feel like there was hope. The day that I heard the Lord speak to me loud and clear, laying in the bed one morning, I heard, go down to the bookstore and get a red leather Bible with your name in the front of it. And that was the last thing I was thinking about. I had a Bible. I read it. After acting like I really didn't hear what the Lord had spoke to me, I tried to go on with my day. But I could not shake it. I know what I heard. Go down to the bookstore, get a red leather Bible, and get your name put on the front of it. The older woman at the old Lutheran bookstore must have thought I was crazy. I wasn't very well kept those days. And it was a very old bookstore, and I could tell I wasn't one of their regular customers. After searching the back room and returning with the only red leather Bible in the store and persuading the gentleman in the back to monogram my name on the front of it, I was all set. At first, I didn't even read it. I'm sure I didn't explain it to my wife, why I actually purchased it. I just knew it was the most beautiful Bible I'd ever seen. It was so beautiful that Sunday, I got up and got ready for church. I'm pretty sure I just went to show off my new Bible. You see, God will meet you wherever you are in your life. He'll meet you at the point of your needs. The Lord speaks so clearly that even me, a newly reborn Christian, tormented and distraught and hopeless, and with one touch of his hand, lifted the burdens. Learning from reading the Word of God that all my hurts, habits, and hang-ups can and will help somebody else in the same position and show the power of the Lord and his grace and mercy for us. For the first time, I could understand that it wasn't about me. It was about what I can do. It was about what I could do to show how much the Lord had brought me through. The Lord had truly taken away so much pain and anger. All I did was think of him. I'm thankful for God allowing me to have a wonderful wife and children who through it all supported me even when they didn't understand what was going on. In 2002, after fighting a lengthy battle with cancer, my mother was now in hospice at our home. She had been in the hospital in Michigan for a while, and after a few visits there, she told me she just wanted to go home, meaning back to Fort Wayne where we lived. I'm not sure how I became involved with a comedy show at the local place called Ellington's, but I would eventually end up hosting a comedy show there. No one knew exactly why. I was a manager at a car lot at a local car dealership during the day, hosted a comedy show at night. The real reason I did the show was an attempt to deal with the pain of knowing my mother was on her last days. By now, she was on a respirator, and the sound could be heard throughout the house. I did the shows just to stay away, only to cope. When I was there, the last show I hosted was the night the Lord spoke to me again. Once again, my brother who did all the music for me, as he brought me on the stage just like normal, I grabbed the microphone and looked at the crowd, and I heard, "I can't believe you're going to stand here and tell these nasty jokes, but you will not testify in church." The Lord didn't say testify about anything in particular. And as I tried to continue with my opening joke, I heard the voice again. I can't believe you're going to stand up here and tell all these foul, nasty jokes, and you won't testify in church. I brought on the first comic, walked off the stage, and through the glass front windows, everybody could see me leave. Go to my car, and I never took the stage again. And that night when I got home earlier than usual, my wife asked, what was I doing there so soon? I didn't explain right then. I stopped by my mom's room to check on her. Before, whenever I had a question about my spiritual things, I would ask her. I laid down, and before the hour passed, Gail touched me and said Mom had passed. She was a prayer warrior in the end, mother of the church, and also a founding member. She passed away with her hands folded, the way she often prayed. From that point on, I've been compelled to testify about everything the Lord has brought me through and blessed me with. Also, how the Lord spoke to me on more than one occasion. Calm words of encouragement at times when I didn't think I could make it through. God's timing is not something that I can try to figure out. I just know it's always the right time. Why did he speak that night? I don't know. I know that after the following Sunday's testimony, my first honest testimony, I had never felt more relief from any past hurts, habits, hang-ups, or whatever I was going through. I now believe that a power greater than myself can restore me to sanity. For it is God who works in us, for it is God who works in you to will and to act accordingly to his good purpose. A large portion of my step 8 was devoted to my wife and children and my ex-wife. Step 9 was hard, but when I had to ask the questions, what did I do? Did I do anything that I needed to apologize for and try to make amends? My daughter certainly took advantage of those conversations and had no problem saying exactly what she thought. And she was right. Now my relationship with my family is the best it's ever been. And I receive so much love and support. At this point, I'm just trying to do whatever the Lord is telling me to do. Matthew 5:6 says, happy are those whose greatest desire is to do what the Lord requires. I still have hurts, habits, and hang-ups, but now I don't feel like I'm drowning in them. I knew God was the answer, and I was learning how much it meant to him to have me serve. I know my life was certainly still unmanageable. I took a ministry course, worked closely with my pastor, and was part of the leadership team for the men's group. My wife and I headed the couples ministry, taught lessons, but there was still a void I couldn't fill. I didn't feel like I was using all my past experience to really help anybody. Sometime during my testimony, I would share small bits and pieces, but even then, it always seemed to help someone. By then, I was a manager of a local dealership and had 4 back surgeries and 5 leg surgeries. And I decided in 2008 that it was time to slow down. And me and my wife opened a barbershop and salon with a strong gospel atmosphere. And we're well welcome in the neighborhood. My wife was semi-retired after 30 years at the local hospital and really wanted to be closer to our grandchildren here in Texas. I have a grandson who is named after me, and I have only seen him 3 times. And he had just turned 3. So we came to Austin not knowing what to expect. Here it seemed there was no one here to tell how God had delivered me from drugs and alcohol, sexual addictions, abandonment issues, health issues. We visited a few churches in Austin, and finally, we were invited to Greater Mount Zion. Thank God. Because after joining, we were invited to a new members' luncheon, and I met Pastor Peyton, the ministry coach for Celebrate Recovery. I had never heard of it before, but after only a few minutes of him telling me what CR was about, I had to know more about it. Could it be a program out there that would address my exact desire? I really could openly share my past hurts and habits and in a safe place and help somebody. I came to his office the very next Tuesday, and I don't think I slept that much in between. I had to know more about this program. The Lord was still making a way for me to do a work for him. I believe the first pamphlet he showed me was Growing in Christ while Helping Others. And he read what he called one of the 8 Beatitudes, yield myself to God to bring this good news to others, that you do matter to God and he loves you and has the power to help you recover. That was the first time I ever heard the phrase, realize I'm not God and admit that I'm powerless. Up to that point, I thought I was doing it on my own. And to control my tendencies to do the wrong thing, that my life was unmanageable. The Lord has spoken through His Holy Spirit, visions, dreams, and my prayer continues to be the same, that Celebrate Recovery will aid me in helping others and glorify God by showing them a Christian alternative to getting help for all their hurts, habits, and fears. My personal testimony of recovery is one way to glorify God. I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ, and this is my testimony.